Thank you all as we hurtle towards the end of the festival with a few more sessions left. Absolutely delighted to have some amazing writers, and I've been delving or deep diving into their work over the last few weeks, and each time I just gasp with the sheer beauty of what they have written, both poetry and prose. So very quickly, I'm just going to give you a brief introduction and then wade straight into it. That's Meenal, all the way from New Zealand through to Los Angeles via Detroit, Michigan, New York, Bangalore. She's a writer from a very early age. I think the first thing she started writing was when she was 7 or 8 years old, if I'm not mistaken, in New Zealand, where her teacher just loved what she had written. And ever since then, she used writing, in a sense, to actually withdraw from some of the many questions, including racism and sexuality, that she had to confront. And for those of you who get a chance, do pick up the book. It's absolutely stunning, and thank you for sharing it with all of us. I've had the privilege of launching Anush Irani's new book, The Parcel, which he completed and published earlier this year. Anush is an award-winning author and playwright from Canada. Many of his plays continue to find a stage and audiences, more importantly. One of them is still running, I think, in Vancouver as we speak. The Parcel is a stunning novel, and in fact, I said in an interview some time ago that for me it was one of the best novels that I'd read in the first 6 months of 2017. It looks at, it's written from the voice of Madhu, if I've got the name right. And Madhu is a young boy who chose to become a transvestite, chose to become what we call back in India a hijra. Anush's rare skill is that much of his growing up life was spent actually overlooking a place called Kamathipura, which is the red light district of Bombay, a very busy, a very intense place with all kinds of horrifying incidents a lot of the time, but also so much of soul and so much of feeling. And when I read the book, and I know the present guru of the Hijras, she's the Mahamandaleshwari, which is the top religious head of the Hijra community. And when I read this, I was like, oh my God, he must have spent years just researching this. And he said, no, I just sat down and I wrote it from all the experiences that I had. So Anush, welcome to that. Amber's work I've had the pleasure of discovering, and the book that I've been reading is Refocusing My Family, which again, you all must pick up. What I found, and I didn't understand this at all, is that she belonged to a community which is called Focus on the Family Executive, and I asked her, would many of you be aware of this group? Are you aware of this group? And you know, I was fascinated because I didn't even know that this existed, and you know, I am going to be asking her how within this very closed and perhaps conflicted group of people, she was able to come out and write this extremely brave and extremely wonderful book. So thank you very much, Amber, for being here. We don't have Janice, so I'm going to come to Janice at the end and maybe read a little poem of hers. But before I go there, Chrysosto Apache, his work, Two Spirits, which again I had the occasion of reading because he was able to share that with me. Incredible within, again, the Native American community. I mean, being from India, I remember when I was in London growing up, my teacher, my French teacher asked me, so are you a Indian or are you a Paki Indian? And for those of us who've been brought up on cowboy films, you know, for us that whole genre of what was then known as, Native Americans known as Red Indian, was fascinating. And the Apaches, that we lived our lives, pretending that we were chief whoever and whatever. So amazingly brave work again so thank you so much for being here. And as Janice maybe is lost somewhere in the library or between here and there, I'm going to just as introduction read you just the end of one of her poems, which I thought was fantastic and perhaps the way to start this session. And this is from The Girl I Used to Be, and this is the last sort of paragraph of it. I was the girl who seldom spoke, who slept alone, fully clothed, ready to bolt into the startled dawn. Then one day, enticed by stones, this girl plunged into a clear Sierra stream and rose, gasping from that brutal creek, terrified but absolutely clean. So thank you all for being here today, and perhaps I should start with Amber, with you telling us a little bit about this particular community. And even in your introduction, you define yourself as an LGBTQ Christian, and that fascinated me, and perhaps you could touch upon that and also tell us about this particular community that you grew up in and why it was so difficult within that community to be accepted.
So I was part of Focus on the Family, and for those of you who don't know or aren't familiar, it is based in Colorado Springs, and it's very fundamental Christian evangelical. And so I was homeschooled all my life and kind of kept within this Christian bubble that said anybody that is different, is diverse, is not okay. We were kind of kept where everybody believed the same thing, everybody taught the same thing, we were all very much alike. And so I wasn't really exposed to any kind of diversity of really any kind, whether that was race or disability or sexual orientation. And that really kind of hindered me from being able to reconcile my own sexuality as I came out later in life. I was homeschooled, I was very much kept within the church population of evangelical Christianity. And Focus on the Family itself is known for it's known as being very conservative Christian. It's known for having family values, which is kind of ironic because when I then came out later in my life, that was, being gay was the one thing you were never supposed to be. And so my family then disowned me. And so really what you would think would be the thing that ties you together as a family and bonds you together is actually what drove us apart. And so I have had no contact with my family for 4 years now. And I had my wife is here today. They've never met my wife. I had no family at my wedding. It was really the wedge that just drove us apart. And we had always been such a close family growing up, because those principles of Focus on the Family and that James Dobson teaches were really just fundamental to who you were. And everybody, yes, in Colorado Springs and in Colorado, but across the nation, even around the world, look to this organization as evangelical Christians to kind of lead the way on parenting and on family values. And so when you come from within that, and that then those people are the ones that drive you away, that was something that was very hard to grapple with.
I'd love to know, because much of the writing is also about how you were homeschooled. And within the community itself, when you're saying that you were separate, when the family rejected you, did your family, meaning your own nuclear family and the larger family of the evangelical group, did they all reject you, or did you have soulmates there who then stood by you or at least acknowledged both your sexuality and your identity?
I could probably count on one hand the amount of people that are still in my life now that were before I came out. It was not only my nuclear family, my parents and my brother all disowned me, but it was all my relatives too. And I came from a pretty big family, of relatives and grandparents and cousins, and I only had one cousin that stood by me, and everybody else has turned their back on me. So, and really, I lost my family, but I also lost almost all my friends. I lost my church community because it was unacceptable there. And I got so tired of having to hide who I was all the time and always having to wear this mask of perfection and role model. And everybody knew who my family was and what my dad did at Focus. And my dad's worked there for almost 30 years, and he continues to this day. And so I think one of the hardest things for me to grapple with was the fact that their reputation and their appearance of family was more important than their their own daughter. And that's been one of the hardest
It's
things.
also, again, within, your larger reservation or community, how were you able to how were you able to come out, and what's the kind of acceptability? Because what really struck me was two spirits, and the acceptance in many of the older traditions that two spirits can dwell together, and that's acceptable. And was that a challenge in your community?
Growing up for me it was difficult because one of the things you have to sort of understand is that growing up on a reservation, we did have fundamental religion that influenced a lot of Native American communities. So we grew up with that idea, but on the other side of that, there are
Please
many...
welcome Janice. Sorry. I've introduced you by reading the end of one of your poems, but please come. Sorry, go ahead, Krista.
What I was saying is that on the flip side of that is that, we're also influenced by our own traditional cultural beliefs. And all the different places that I've gone and all the different communities that I've talked to across the country, I've found out a lot of the older people have talked about a time where gender expression and sexuality was a form that was fairly accepted by the people because the communities and tribal people lived as a community. So they all had to survive, so everybody had to participate in the communal setting. But today, it's so different. I grew up with the same situations as, influenced by a lot of religious denominations, and it was very difficult. And that's what I knew. But the older I got, I started to do some more research and I started more advocacy work, and then I realized that I didn't necessarily have to live this way. But one of the things that I really appreciate is that my family still held on to a lot of their cultural tribal beliefs, that however I chose to be was how they accepted me and allowed me to live in that way. So my spouse now has also participated and has been able to participate in the cultural parts of our livelihood, which my family has come to accept him as part of the family, which I really do appreciate. And I think I'm one of those fortunate people because I've heard a lot of similar stories of families disowning their children, and it's so disheartening to hear that. But I think one of the things that I really try to do is sort of write about that, because I think the words have a powerful way of distributing those kinds of stories to especially if the word gets published. People have access to that kind of information and who may be in similar situations.
Meenal, coming to you, being carted off to New Zealand in a baby basket all the way, growing up a bit there and then coming here to the United States. Your coming out, in a sense, happened by accident because your parents found this particular parcel that you were trying to redirect to your new residence, which they opened and perhaps discovered and then sat you down, and you weren't able to express yourself at that point of time. And at the end of the writing, what really fascinated me is what you said is, so when I finish writing this, my relatives and everybody will know who I am and what I am. What happened and what was their reaction? Because your mother, and in your writing, what at least appears is that your father was way more supportive and in a sense accepting than your mother, who was like, get married, this is not acceptable. And your fight with your conflict with your mother was far greater than perhaps with your father. And that's interesting in terms of how women, in a sense, across ages also continue to be the dominating figure in everybody's life of trying to keep to a particular line. So if you can touch on both the coming out and the mother-father story, and what was the larger relatives?
Yeah, so I come from a huge family. I have 35 first cousins, and my family right now is in 9 different countries all over the world, and I traveled to all of them in order to write this book, which is about how that migration happened. And when I traveled, I was interviewing relatives about their stories and their migrations, and so I was actually getting quite deep into their lives, and I struggled a little bit with how forthcoming to be about my own life, and made different choices with different people, and so then I realized, of course, that when the book came out, it would be this kind of big coming out, and this was just at the cusp of the social media world. So it was before everybody could just, look you up and see what you were up to, which is now a much easier way of coming out to people. And, I think with my parents, both of my parents really went through a long evolution from the point in time when I first came out 27 years ago. And as you say, I was outed by UPS, which sent the box to the wrong place. And they had a really difficult reaction at that time. They couldn't understand it. I had trouble expressing it. I came from a very conservative family in which almost all of my cousins to this day, and even their children, continue to have arranged marriages within the community, within the caste. And so, even the fact that my brother around the same time was dating a white woman, that was a big deal. And that was really hard for them. And so I think for both of my parents, it was both the radical departure from the values that they thought that they had raised us with, and also the fact that we were lying, and my brother and I both were lying and concealing our sexual lives from our parents because we knew that they wouldn't be accepted. All of that was really difficult. And I have to say that to my parents' credit, they, over the years, really came around, and the book was part of that process. I think that through reading particularly this chapter, which is my chapter about myself, that they sort of came to understand my thinking a little bit better. In terms of the response, I showed them a draft before it was published, and so my father at the time, read it without talking to me about it. My mother also read it without talking to me about it, and I had asked them to make margin notes because there are a lot of sort of things to check, facts and dates and spellings and things. So I'd asked them to make notes and give it back to me, which they did. And so I was going through their copy with all their notes and making corrections. And then I realized that in my chapter, my father had paperclipped a 5-page letter to me in which he had asked me really sort of pointedly why I had to write so much about sex and why there was so much sex in the book. And so I thought, oh, let me take a look at what did I write, because I don't remember writing any sex in the book. And I'm afraid if people read it for the sex scenes, you might be a bit disappointed. But there's a fair amount of discussion of my sexual orientation, of my identity, and I think that that's what was really hard for him at that time.
What she also did is she talked about how she lost her virginity, picked up this boy, took him back to the room, her first, and all of it in, like she said, not necessarily explicit, her first kiss with her first girlfriend, the healing process, I love you, etc. Yeah. And it's surprising how that would have shocked them as opposed to...
Yeah, but I think it was so shocking, and I'll also say that my father passed away a few months ago, and at the end of his life, he really had come all the way around. And my wife was with me during the time that he was dying, and he made a point of bringing her in to the family. And we had a lot of other family who were present during his last weeks, and he made his wishes known, and he told everybody that, she's part of the family, she's going to sit in the front row of the funeral with the family, and he said to her, don't let anybody make you feel you don't belong in this family.
Anush, Madhu, when he left by choice from his family and, in a sense, decided to lose a part of his body or his organ, and the distance that created from him and the rest of the normal world as he saw it. When he goes back at the end of your book and he wants to be embraced again by, he's hoping his brother or his mother, etc., but he's not able to press the bell finally and climb up the steps. In your experience, and you've had such an incredible experience in viewing Kamatipura, this sense of alienation, what does it do to people like this? And how do their lives then play out? Rejection again and again?
That's a good question. It's an important one. So as you mentioned, I grew up very close to Kamatipura, which is Bombay's red light district. And, just across the street from where I lived, I used to see the sex workers line up every evening along the walls of a convent school. And so my connection to that world was very visceral. And over the years, also the transgender community in India known as Hijra. And I'll just very briefly tell you the origin of that word for those of you who are not familiar. Some say that it comes from the Urdu phrase Hijrat Karna, which means to migrate. And the thing is, these people, for example, might have been born male, but they sort of identify themselves as female souls trapped in the male form. So in that sense, they're constantly migrating within their own body, trying to find home. And at the same time, they're trying to find home in society, because society sort of pushes them into the cold, into the fringes. And in the novel, Madhu grows up very close to the red light district, but is rejected by his parents because he's considered effeminate. And that is a term in India we use a lot, unfortunately, when we're growing up. Everyone says, stop being such a hijra, which means stop being such a coward. And for me, the thing is, because even though I was a kid, and then once I started seeing the members of the Hijra community, I did not think of them as cowards because of the rejection that they faced. And in my opinion, they've been through much more in one lifetime than someone else might in several. And and from that sort of feeling, I started exploring, and I spoke to a lot of. In the beginning, I just wrote a couple of drafts of the novel without really interviewing someone per se, because I did not want someone's story to interfere with the narration. But after I had the story down, I spoke with members, with one person in particular, and they're very strong, but that deep wound of rejection continues to stay there. It continues to haunt them. And so that gave me, in the novel, that deep wound is what drives the entire novel. And Madhu stands on a bridge, in the book, very close to the building where she grew up. She stands on the bridge and stares at the balcony. Some say that it comes from the Urdu phrase Hijrat Karna, which means to migrate. And the thing is, these people, for example, might have been born male, but they sort of identify themselves as female souls trapped in the male form. So in that sense, they're constantly migrating within their own body, trying to find home. And at the same time, they're trying to find home in society, because society sort of pushes them into the cold, into the fringes. And in the novel, Madhu grows up very close to the red light district, but is rejected by his parents because he's considered effeminate. And that is a term in India we use a lot, unfortunately, when we're growing up. Everyone says, stop being such a hijra, which means stop being such a coward. And for me, the thing is, because even though I was a kid, and then once I started seeing the members of the Hijra community, I did not think of them as cowards because of the rejection that they faced. And in my opinion, they've been through much more in one lifetime than someone else might in several. And and from that sort of feeling, I started exploring, and I spoke to a lot of. In the beginning, I just wrote a couple of drafts of the novel without really interviewing someone per se, because I did not want someone's story to interfere with the narration. But after I had the story down, I spoke with members, with one person in particular, and they're very strong, but that deep wound of rejection continues to stay there. It continues to haunt them. And so that gave me in the novel, that deep wound is what drives the entire novel. And Madhu stands on a bridge, in the book, very close to the building where she grew up. She stands on the bridge and stares at the balcony, where she looks at her father and her mother and her brother, just at night, the silhouettes, and she imagines what life they would have. And she hopes that she can be accepted by them at some point. But within her community, she is taught to forget the old life. When they go through the castration ceremony known as Nirvan, they are not supposed to even look at themselves in the mirror, because they have 40 days to forget the old face. So a lot of it is about disconnection, about forgetting, about not being in touch with their biological family, because they did not accept you. They did not have the understanding to accept you. But in Madhu's case, she feels like a hypocrite, because this is a secret she carries within her of wanting to be accepted by her family. And in the book, finally, after almost 30 years, she comes into contact with her mother, and she sees her mother and her brother in the middle of the afternoon, and she goes up to them and she wants to tell her, look, I am Madhu, I used to be your son, now this is who I am. And the mother just gives her a 5 rupee coin because she thinks she's a beggar. So she doesn't even get a chance to complete her story. She realizes in that moment that she is so far away from who she was, and there's really no place for her in the family.
Janice, before you joined us, I read the last paragraph from The Girl I Used to Be, and your book completely blew me away, both the poetry and the prose, and thank you so much for writing it and sharing it. And I shared with our listeners that last paragraph, and it ended with, but absolutely clean. And love you to talk about, again, in this whole thing of losing something or realizing that you're different in a sense and coming to terms with it. At what point of time does that cleansing happen within, and how can you then articulate it, and is that what the writing is primarily about?
Is it on? Yes. I think maybe the book is a journey to come to a place of self-acceptance. And that, that happens as you grow up, I hope, for most of us. The poem you referred to, of course, is My Young Life, and this book is an excerpt from a longer work which is called This Music, and so it's a sort of a memoir in poetry and prose, or prose poems, I guess. So the very first part of that book, and I think it ends, the first section ends with that poem. In my manuscript, is really just sort of that inward struggle of trying to find self. And in the case of that narrator, it's a departure from home to really find a place. Then the whole journey is a return home, and a way back to accepting not just the person, the narrator, that's actually me, but in my family, my father was transgender, so it's a moment, the book expresses that moment of also accepting my dad for the decisions she made. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Thank you. Meenal, just coming back to this whole thing of acceptance, there you were struggling not just with the sexual identity that you were being challenged with, but also being a person of color in a very working class town where not quite knowing what the kind of race that you later recognized it to be, having both these issues, how difficult was it? Because in a sense, like you say, people ask me where I'm from. Should I say I'm from New Zealand? Should I say I'm from California? Where should I say I'm from? But finally it was about your color and the incident that your mother talks about you know, when this boy follows your cycle with the knife, which you've forgotten at that point of time. Or even when the first time that they trashed the house. How did you deal with that and also the coming of age in terms of the sexuality?
I think it's lovely what you just said about a journey towards self-acceptance, because I think that for both, you know, for sort of all of the elements of oneself, there, for me, has always been this kind of initial experience of rejection, and the wound of that that you spoke about is intense. And then there is a path which seems to begin with seeking acceptance from others, or at least sensing very acutely the lack of acceptance from others. But then the real work for me, and what writing really allows me to do also, is to examine what of that rejection have I internalized, and then how to really apply intelligence and compassion to that internalized oppression, which can manifest in different ways, like self-harm and you know, self-hate. And so for me, I think the shift has been really around more of that journey of growing up and really reaching a point where, you know, I'm 46, so I feel privileged to be responsible for my own life and for my own acceptance of myself, and knowing that we live in an extremely profoundly racist society, that in a country that has been shaped by successive waves of genocide, of enslavement of African Americans, and exclusionary and selective immigration policies. And one of the things that really helped me to understand this was, in researching this book, was looking at immigration policies toward Indians in many different countries, and realizing that even in the United States, the very first act of the first Congress of the United States of America was an immigration act that was designed to allow in the desirable Northern European immigrants and not the undesirable Southern European and other sorts of immigrants. And so it's very interesting to look at how this is deeply rooted in our society, and somehow for me that also depersonalizes it, because it makes it clear to me that, you know, we're all kind of caught in these forces of history, and it's really not about anything that I could have done as a third grader to mitigate my own circumstances or cope better or something like that, but that these are just vast things that we're all part of.
Christoph, you know, talking about what Meenal just said, segregation, which is something that has been practiced again and again, not just in this part of the world, but most parts of the world. Again, in your community, when your community gets so segregated, and there's the whole thing of having you all live on a reservation campus, how does that sort of affect your mind or your worldview? Is there an impact of being just all together as one community and not, in a sense, being part of this larger other?
Well, I think when you take that concept and start to look at it, one of the things that I like to sort of look at myself and how I sort of live in this country is that I'm sort of an immigrant in my own country, right? Because really, ideally, where my people come from, we didn't come from anywhere. We were already here. So really, the immigration isn't something that, you know, we're kind of part of that conversation, but we're not really. And we're also not part of the conversation in a much larger whole when we talk about race, because very rarely Native Americans ever get talked about, you know, and in any context. And, you know, we were sitting on a panel yesterday, and it was Native American writers. But in the entirety of it all, there was a lot more conversations happening about appropriation, about identity, about globalization, but yet here we were placed in a very obscure part of the building, still talking, maybe even about some of the things that might matter to some people. Sexuality is one of those things too. You know, it's a much larger sense, and I'm a poet, so one of my natural things to do when I start addressing these things is to break it apart. So in doing so, what I do is I break myself apart, trying to understand myself in a much larger context. How do I really fit in this country? You know, how is this country defining me as I'm defining myself, as I'm defining my work, right? So it's a really scary place to be, you know. I've certainly grown up with a lot of these fears, dealing with the violence and dealing with, you know, the discrimination and dealing with the compartmentalizing, dealing with the policy, dealing with, you know, all these different, you know, things that really anybody shouldn't have to deal with. But it's more difficult to like pull yourself out of that place, but still have to justify it to other people when you normally shouldn't have ever done that.
Janice and Amber, I think the amazing thing about much of the writing is that there's also a sense of celebration of having come out and having celebrated now, or being reborn in many ways, but really the writing is celebratory and it's wonderfully positive, and there's a healing within it. By the end of this particular excerpt that you said, you can see that you have healed and you've shared and you've come to terms with and you've talked about, etc. If both of you can just share a little bit, and I'm conscious of that we're going to open it up to the public very quickly, just share a little bit about how, having come to that term, now looking ahead, what is ahead, and how you've been able to celebrate the very identity that at one hand you could talk about how depressing and how terrible the struggle was, but now the beyond, the next.
For me, I think it's been celebratory to get to this place where I can celebrate who I am and my relationship with my wife and the family that we're building together, because I did come from a place of such self-hatred and internalized homophobia and self-harm even, because it was so deeply inside of me. I grew up in the heart of the purity culture, where I was taught that true love waits, and we did this whole purity ceremony, and you wore the ring, and you just vowed your life to saving yourself for that husband you would one day meet. And so that really kind of took me off that path, you know, of ever dating or even realizing my own sexuality until much later in life, because I just was taught that this is what you were supposed to do, this is what was expected of you. And so to finally arrive at a place where I feel so at peace within myself has just been wonderful, because yes, I have lost a lot, but it's this interesting place where even in the midst of all that loss and all that grief, I've never felt more comfortable in my own skin. I've never felt more happy, more at peace, more joy. And so looking forward, it's a very positive place for me, because I've been able to kind of let go of that negativity that held me back and be able to embrace who I truly am, and be able to then take that story through my book, you know, to take that story and hopefully reach people that are in similar places, that feel isolated, that feel like they're the only ones, that feel like they don't belong, or they can't be both gay and Christian, or both gay and whatever their faith may be, you know. And so being able to reach those people and give them hope, while also helping create conversations for change among parents and faith leaders and peers and siblings, for them to realize that this isn't just a headline or a news story. This is real families, this is real people, these are real struggles, and help them rethink the way that they respond to their LGBT loved ones and be able to be more inclusive and more embracing because of it.
Thank you for saying all of that. I think I have students who struggle with many of these same issues, and they need our literature, but sadly they don't read enough of it. So that's a big issue for us as well, is getting people to turn to literature as a way to learn how to imagine worlds and how to empathize with others by developing that imagination. I don't know if I know what to say exactly. I feel tongue-tied about this one.
Is there more and more writing that's coming out within the LGBTQ community that celebrates this particular coming out? And is there more and more publishing of work? And is there, in universities, is this being taught as part of literature, or is it still being taught as part of a particular orientation?
I wish I could say. I don't teach in literature, so, which is a kind of a bizarre irony, is that I'm a poet, but I don't teach literature classes. So I teach a Native American literature class. There are presses, for example, Headmistress, which published my work just recently. That's a fine publisher of LGBTQ. But primarily lesbian writing. So those publishers are out there. Christoso, why don't you say something?
Anuj, just before opening up, love you to talk a little bit about the politics of LGBTQ in India. I mean, the politics of LGBTQ, certainly transgender, everybody says, is one of the reasons why the Democrat Party and Hillary Clinton may have lost, because of the third a bathroom issue here. But can you just sort of touch upon the politics back home?
Well, in 2014, for example, the Supreme Court passed a judgment saying that the Hijra community will be officially recognized as the third gender. And while that is fantastic, you know, at the same time there are challenges. It's just the beginning. So for example, in June of this year, in the Kochi Metro, they had hired 23 transgender employees, which is again good. It's a good thing. The problem was that some of them just did not get accommodation within the city because people thought that, you know, they will use the dwellings for sex work, or because of the social stigma attached to being a hijra. You know, they are mired in superstition, they are still attached to, there's a lot of mythological beliefs and a fear surrounding them that they can either bless you or curse you, or if a hijra sort of flashes you, it's bad luck and you're doomed. So all of that is still in the minds of the so-called mainstream society. And one of the, I interviewed this amazing person called Simran Sheikh, who used to be, you know, her character, when I ended up listening to her story, it was very close to the character in my book. So she was born a boy and then, you know, joined the Hijra community at a young age, at the age of 14. But she also worked as a sex worker, then as a bar dancer in Bombay, and now works as a program officer in an NGO. And she told me, when I asked her about these changes, she said, look, the old man has just been given a stick. Now the old man must learn how to walk.
And I'm going to open, I'm going to open it up. So maybe we can borrow two of the mics from our speakers. Of course, there's a million more questions to ask them, especially on the politics of it, but perhaps maybe we can start here right up front and then go to the second row and then go to the third row.
Hi. I'd like to start off with Anash. My question has to do with what do you feel are the most effective tools to the panel to overcome shame and rejection? What tools have helped you, have been the most? And specifically to you, sir, what did all your years of seeing those sorts of things go on, what did you find to be the major coping skill of people so traumatized?
You know, I didn't really think about my own coping because my pain is absolutely zero compared to what I was witnessing and listening to, and that was the main reason I wrote this book. You know, a lot of people have asked me, but you're not transgender and you sort of inhabit, in a way, the inner life, the most intricate inner life of a transgender character. And the thing for me is years and years of just walking through the red light district and seeing young girls being trafficked, as in not seeing them, but knowing that they're there, that they're kept in cages, seeing members of the Hijra community sort of just begging or, you know, doing sex work. I'm writing more as a witness, you know, and I don't think one can write out of fascination. That's too weak an entry point into somebody else's life. So my connection was that I was deeply affected by it. I was haunted. At the same time, I was inspired by the sheer bravery of these individuals, and horrified by what human beings do to each other. You know, Dostoevsky has this phrase where he says, you know, man is the only being capable of artistic cruelty. You know, beasts will tear each other apart, but they do it out of survival and to eat. But human beings make an art form out of torture. And that is something that it's something that stayed, of course I didn't read Dostoevsky as a child,
right.
But, you know, it's something that stayed with me.
Would be, in your opinion, the key element to a person in that sort of survival mode?
I think I'll let someone else answer that question.
Key element to survival. We get it back and then.
I think going back to your question about shame, the best resource I know of would be Brené Brown. She's done like 30 years of research on shame and vulnerability, and just from the books that I've read alone, it is incredibly insightful, and it's very uncomfortable because it's something that our culture is so used to holding on to and internalizing, but it was very freeing to look at it from her perspective and the research that she's done, and so I would really highly recommend her books as one of the best tools for shame.
My questions are for Mr. Irani as well as Ms. Hajratwala. I'm a writer in Gujarati. I just wrote a book on rehabilitation of prostitutes of Kamatipura, as you said. My question is, what is as the previous generation has got a taboo against writing about sex and sexuality, but what do you think about the new generation of India? And Ms. Hajratwala, I have written a book on female genital mutilation. How does it relate to the sexuality?
I don't know anything actually about female genital mutilation. Not on. Oh, there's better. I actually don't know much about female genital mutilation in India. It's not practiced in my community, and it's outside my experience. So you're probably more the expert on that. But I would say that, in general, yes, of course, the taboo on not only writing about, but also speaking about and showing in film depictions of sexuality is shifting dramatically in India. And, you know, and I think there is an exploitative element of that, and there is a progressive element of that. And I think it's really one of the key things is the shame factor, and what you just said is really interesting about the fascination. Like, are we looking at sexuality as something titillating, or are we looking at it as part of the normal spectrum of human behavior and expression? And I think that in the tone of that is where you can see whether it's actually progress or not progress.
This question is mainly for Amber. It was mainly inspired by what you said, but also I think Anosh, like some of what you were talking about would touch on it. But it's or actually all of it, a lot of it. But it was mainly like Amber, you said that you just like split off from your family, right? After like being like kept in that incubator all your life, and then you just leave it, and you're basically like left high and dry. And so I was wondering if you could talk about like building a community for yourself and finding a community within which you could live and within which you could survive that was drastically different from what you had grown up with.
Absolutely. For me, it really was finding that community that saved my life. Because when you grow up in that incubated community where you're so close with everyone and that kind of group follows you all your life and then suddenly that's split off from you, it was devastating. I was, suicidal, I was self-harming, I was depressed, I had anxiety and PTSD and all this stuff. And it really, for me, was finding a supportive community that embraced all of who I was, as well as fostered my faith. And those two elements together were able to not only help me accept myself, but then also feel like I was part of a larger community of people. And so for me, that was, because I'm from here in Denver, and so for me that was Highlands Church, and that was where I was able to kind of find that community. And really that made all the difference in the world for me in so many areas, because when it came time for me to get married, none of my family was present at our wedding, and it was the people in that community that I had built relationships with that came and stood in as my honorary family and walked me down the aisle and gave me away and filled in all those empty moments where my family should have been. So I am a huge advocate for finding supportive community even before you come out, because you're going to need them, through that coming out process and through that time where you just really need support. And so I'm a huge advocate for finding a good supportive community that really will foster your identity and your faith if that's a part of your life.
Hi, I just wanted to ask a question. I've been able to teach LGBTQ Lit, and I've noticed that there seems to be a discrepancy between the literature, particularly of the 21st century, and our lived experience. The early LGBTQ Lit is very much involved in some of the issues we've been discussing, like shame, rejection, etc. And that goes up through maybe the film Boys in the Band, when there's a lot of nasty, sort of self-hatred expressed. But then in the 21st century, I just see a lot of sort of celebration, and almost as if LGBTQ identity is almost a secondary issue to the book. It's just an accepted thing. Yes, we have this character, or it's in the community, and the focus of the literature is not really about this agonizing coming out process. It's just about living a sort of ordinary life. And yet we still, and my students still would tell stories of what we're hearing, from you about rejection and doubt and shame. So I'm just wondering what your comments are about that. Why do you think the culture is so far behind the literature?
Well, actually,
and if you think it is, really.
If I may say, I don't actually share that perception. I do think that the early LGBT literature was very much focused on coming out, and now there's a much broader range. But it's not that the coming out stories are not being told. I mean, there are amazing books like Amber's and many others that are being written that really grapple with that issue, but it's also a spectrum, because we now have, second, third generation LGBTQ kids. We have kids who are coming out in middle school or even earlier as genderqueer, and their parents are fine with it. And, we don't necessarily need a literature that's like all agony all the time. Or as we said in India, you know, the early lesbian literature was very much rona dhona, right? Which is like weeping and drama. And when, you know, when we look at what we want to publish now in lesbian literature, we also want to show, you know, relationships and complexities and things that are really about, you know, maybe we need like kind of a Melrose Place kind of, you know, or just a soap opera kind of version that's literature that's for us and for our consumption and our entertainment as well.
Anybody? Sorry. Right here. Yeah.
Oops, sorry. So my question is for Anush, and it's going to air my own ignorance, so I apologize for that. Growing up in India, I always thought and was told that the Hijra community were hermaphrodites, folks that were born with female and male genitals. So is it now sort of the transgender mixed with the hermaphrodites, or what's, I'm a little confused.
Well, there's a Persian word called hiz, which again is, some say that the word hijra is derived from that, which means impotent or hermaphrodite. But it's not it's a small portion of the hijra community that are born hermaphrodites. Okay. Majority of them are sort of, like I said earlier,
by choice.
Well, yes, they identify as female souls trapped in a male form. Okay. And they find comfort or they find home in the third gender. They identify themselves as neither male nor female. Okay. They identify themselves as the third gender. Some of them may get themselves voluntarily castrated. Some don't. Some continue to have the male genitalia. But, you know, hijra is not just about physicality. It is about soul.
Sure.
You know,
sure.
And that is the whole point. The hijra community in India is defined by a guru-disciple relationship. So when you spoke about finding community, that is one of the things that the hijra community offers people. They can even live together, all of them. And the guru it then becomes the spiritual guide, the protector, the mother, the father, the employer and the exploiter. Everything. So it's very different from the Western notion of transgender.
Can I ask, do we have 2 seconds to ask? So just going back to what he said, you know, in many of the Asian religious sort of beliefs, the third gender is very much seen to be in that context of religious, and they have a particular religious duty that they're also tasked with. In the Native American tradition, is that also part of the tradition, or is it always been completely separate? I mean, were they ever given a particular sort of religious or spiritual, sorry, religious being the wrong word, spiritual duty within the ancient Native American context?
Well, when we talk about culture here in the United States, I know that we talk about a lot of different tribes, and each one of them practices very differently and have different belief systems for how they sort of incorporate the gender structure. But many of them have places where, you know, the two-spirit person can conduct ceremonial rituals. And a lot of them do take the idea of canceling couples, a lot of times take on the orphans. They also take care of the elders. They're really kind of the people that bring the community together as well. But, you know, today, I mean, it's such a different definition and how that is incorporated in many of these tribal communities. And it can be a much larger dialogue now, knowing that there is this idea of two-spirit that does exist. And it varies from tribe to tribe and from culture to culture on how they designate that gender and sexuality expression, such as the Dene Navajo. They believe in 4, and I know that sometimes they also believe in 6 gender identities. So it just really depends. I mean, we can move beyond this idea of this binary, which I think is what I would like to explore. And how do we start breaking down these boundaries of male and female and not have to confine ourselves within that structure? When I write, I try to not think of it in those terms. One of the poems that I have constructed is called Quadrants, which was published by Hawaii Review. The idea behind that is sort of, looking at these structures and how we relate to this identity of male and female, and how that is related to a much longer identity in the world itself.
Right, on that happy note, I'm wondering whether I should ask Janice to conclude with reading a poem, but I think no. So thank you all very much. Please thank this incredible group of amazing people. Thank you. And thank you all, and thank you all for being part of the festival, and thank you very much, Johnny.
So several of the authors will be available for book signings afterwards. Minal, Anush, Amber will be there, and I'll check with Janice. Thank you.
Nimbuda, 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 kacha, kacha, chota, chota, nimbuda, laye de, nimbuda, laye, 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 laye de, man laye de, laye de, man laye de, laye de, na de mari choti na na na, de laye, 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 kacha, nimbuda, laye, laye de. जो धोने थे हालो 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 पिया लेरियो लाए दो ओ मन लाए दो मन लाए दो सामारी छोटी ननदरा तेरा भागरा काचा निबुड़ा लाए दे Nimbuda, 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 nimbuda,